Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the very first program of the 2024, 2025 seminars. It's an historical society, so I think it's passed all the time. But welcome to our 2024-25 season. This is a very special event, which is being sponsored by two series that we offer, the Environmental History series, as well as the New England Biography series. And allow me to take the opportunity to thank the members of the steering committee for both of these series. They are Phyllis Anderson, Carl Haglund, Megan Kate Nelson, Chris Parsons, Andrew Robichaud, Megan Marshall, Julie Dobrow, and Natalie Dykstra. My name is Kenneth Horn Wong Street Chanlai. I'm the Director of Research here at the MHS. And for those of you who are new to our institution, we are the first historical society in the nation. We are home to 14 million manuscript pages and counting. And among them are the papers of the Adams family, 3 generations of the Adams family, as well as Thomas Jefferson's personal papers. So we are 2.5 presidential libraries, but we also have the papers of abolitionists and merchants and historians and civil rights campaigners and scientific pioneers and political leaders and people from almost all walks of life. So we invite you to take a look at our website to see what our library can offer you. We also offer seminars that take place over the course of the academic year. So we are just getting started here in September, and these will run through May. And our seminar series generally feature workshops of chapters, pre-circulated chapters, or essays or conversations about the craft of history or the craft of biography. There are 7 seminar series, and generally there is one every week during the season. So there's African American history, early American history, modern American history, environmental history, the history of women, gender, and sexuality, digital history, and our biography series as well. We encourage you to visit our website in the coming weeks to see the fall lineup. Today's program will proceed as follows. I shall introduce our moderator for the evening, Professor Andrew Robichaud, a member of the Environmental History Seminar Steering Committee, will then introduce our presenter, Professor Catherine McNeur. Professor McNeur will speak for approximately 15 minutes from the podium. After that, she will join Professor Robichaud in a conversation about the book, and that will take approximately 30 minutes, which leaves plenty of time for questions from the audience here in the room and folks joining us online. If you are in the room, wait till the microphone is right up to you before asking the question so folks online can hear you. And if you have a question online, simply type your question into the Q&A box, and Cassie Cloutier, our Assistant Director of Research, will read it on your behalf. Professor McNeur will also gladly sign books for folks who are here in person. For those who are joining us online, if you are interested in the volume, we encourage you to purchase a copy from your local independent bookstore. And now, it is my pleasure to introduce Andrew Robichaud, who's Associate Professor and also the Director of Graduate Studies in the Department of History at Boston University. He teaches courses on environmental, urban, and animal history, as well as the history of Boston. Harvard University Press published his first book, Animal City, The Domestication of America, in 2019. And he is currently working on a book tentatively titled On Ice, America's 19th Century Ice Age and the Making of Modern Life. Professor Robichaud.
Good evening, everybody. And I'm Andy Robichaud, Professor of History at BU. And I'd like to thank a few people first before we get started for making this event possible. And first, I want to really give big thanks to Kid and Cassie here at MHS, along with the MHS staff and members who keep this organization such a vital part of our historical community. We don't know how you do it with all these different events, but we are very grateful that you do. So thank you. Thanks also to the folks on the Biography and Environmental History Seminar Series, the steering committees who made this event possible. I'd also like to thank the BU History Department, BU American Political History Institute, and the BU American New England Studies Program for co-sponsoring the event. Thanks to everyone who's joined us here in person and to the many people who are out there in Zoom land for being here as well. And finally, thanks to Catherine McNeur for being here and for talking to us about this really wonderful book. I will just offer a brief introduction and then turn it over to Catherine for a short overview. Then, as Kid said, we'll move into a discussion between me and Catherine before opening it up to a broader Q&A. So if you have questions, please hold on to them. And if you've got them in Zoom land, you can type them into the chat. But first, I wanted to introduce our guest. Catherine McNeur is professor of history at Portland State University. She earned her BA in urban design and architecture studies from NYU and went on to earn her PhD in history from Yale. Her first book, Taming Manhattan: Environmental Battles in the Antebellum City, was published by Harvard University Press, won several major awards from the American Society for Environmental History and the Society for the Historians of the Early American Republic, to name two, along with others. Tonight, Catherine will be talking about her newest book, which came out with Basic Books at the end of 2023, which is called Mischievous Creatures: The Forgotten Sisters Who Transformed Early American Science. And it's about Elizabeth and Margaretta Morris, who worked in 19th century Philadelphia. It's a braided biography. It's a beautiful piece of writing, a very complicated design to it, but interesting design to it, which maybe we can talk about as well. Along with a very important story of science and gender in 19th century America. And it really weaves together so much more into this beautiful narrative. So if you haven't read the book for tonight, that's okay. Grab a copy on your way out. And you are in for a treat when you finally do. As Kid said, we do have copies of the book and there's time for signing afterwards. So stick around for that too. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Catherine McNeur.
Thank you all, and thank you, Kid and Kathy and Andy, for that lovely introduction. I thought before we jump into the discussion, I'd just give you an overview of the book because no one has ever really heard of these women, or generally, unless you've read the book. Margaretta Morris and Elizabeth Carrington Morris, we're basically erased from history. And so I just wanted to give you a quick overview of who they were, where they were working, and what they were doing, so you can kind of get a sense of the setting for everything. So these are the sisters. For the longest time, when I first uncovered their story, I couldn't find pictures of them. It was like if you did a Google search for them, nothing came up. There were no photos online. But eventually I came across these at the University of Delaware special collections, but it took a lot of digging, archival digging, to be able to just envision who they were and what they looked like. But they were two sisters. They lived together their entire lives. Their entire lives. They never married. They lived in the suburb of Philadelphia, Germantown, which during their lifetimes became part of Philadelphia. Margaretta, on the left side here, studied entomology. She focused primarily on agricultural pests, or various kind of agricultural entomology. And Elizabeth focused on botany. She was a specialist in ferns specifically, but she had a broad interest. They had private tutors. A lot of their early history was difficult to uncover, but I found that they were tutored by really the leading naturalists of this time period. Names I'll throw around, like Thomas Nuttall and Thomas Say. Thomas Nuttall was sort of the father, one of the early botany professors at Harvard, and he moved down to Philadelphia. Thomas Say was the so-called father of zoology and father of entomology in America. And a number of other well-known naturalists of the early 19th century who couldn't make ends meet as scientists, and so served as tutors to kind of fill in the gaps. Kind of the way that artists nowadays might serve as art teachers in a K through 12 and then also do art and science. That's how scientists were working in this early period in the 18 teens when these women were teenagers. Because they were women, they were very much constricted in terms of where they did their work. So they stayed mostly in their garden, which was an elaborate botanical garden, one of the early botanical gardens of this time period, along with Bartram's in Philadelphia. This was another one. They did a lot of research in their backyard, and they also went to the Wissahickon Creek, which was in walking distance, about a mile from their house, and did a lot of botanical exploration and entomological exploration there to sort of discover new things and work on puzzles. And they both had connections with many scientists that you know the names of. People like Charles Darwin, who was really interested in some of the discoveries Margaretta was making, and Louis Agassiz, who came to their backyard to witness some of the cicada discoveries that Margaretta made. Asa Gray of Harvard was a close friend and connection to Elizabeth Morris. And Bronson Alcott opened up a kindergarten and worked in the elementary education in Germantown, and these women worked alongside him. Dorothea Dix was a close friend and maybe even a lover of Margaretta. So there are all these famous people that they're kind of a footnote to the history of these other people, if you read biographies of them. But and in that way, I was able to find some of their stories. But one of the things I particularly love about studying two sisters is that they were quite different. They made very different decisions about how they did science and how they put themselves out into the world. And because of that, I got to see the range of what was possible for women to decide about their lives during this period. So they had the same tutors, they grew up in the same home, they had the same connections socially, they had the same library, they worked in the same laboratory in the top floor of their home. They went on the same hikes along the Wissahickon, and yet they chose completely different careers. Elizabeth, the botanist, decided to be very anonymous. That was how she preferred to work behind the scenes, whereas Margaretta pushed herself out into arguments with other entomologists and kind of seeing herself as an equal and a peer, and wrote under her own name too. So they made totally different decisions about how they wanted to do science in the world. And I find that really compelling, and also the ways that they work together with these different skill sets. So this is Margaretta Morris, a different photo. I'll show all the photos I was able to find of her, the daguerreotypes. She was one of the first women who was elected to the American Association for the Advancement of Science. There were two who were elected in 1850, Maria Mitchell being the other one, the astronomer, much better known. But Margaretta was also elected that same year. Louis Agassiz was their sponsor for that election. She was also one of the first women elected to the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia. So again, those are the kind of people who normally have biographies much earlier in their lives. They normally had a obituary even when they passed away, but these women did not. And as I said, she focused primarily on insect pests or agricultural entomology. She made some serious discoveries about Hessian flies, which you see on the kind of left side of that over there. Also about how 17-year cicadas subsisted underground for 17 years by sucking at the roots of fruit trees and other trees that she dug up. And also she discovered a new cicada species, one that we continue to see emerge every 17 years, known as the Magicicada cassini, although she was actually the discoverer. That's a longer story, which I can get into later, but the naming was stolen from her too. And as I said, Darwin was interested in some of the research that she had done on water beetles in lakes in northern Pennsylvania that were traveling with fish eggs stuck to their legs, and would travel and populate different ponds and lakes with those fish. And so he was interested in the distribution of species on the origins of species, and looked to her research after kind of playing a 19th century game of telephone, essentially, where he had gotten word that she had told someone else who told his friend about this story. He did not believe her. He didn't believe that lady in North America is how to put it. But similar stories got into on the origins of species ultimately. She was a science writer, prolific. She wrote anonymously under an old lady pseudonym who was interested in entomology, but then she also wrote under her own name. And as I mentioned, she discovered several species, though was little credited for that. And she also understood and wrote about ecology very early on, and talked about the interweaving of different relationships in her yard by discovering the ways that moles were interacting with cicadas, were interacting with the trees in her yard. So she was describing things that wouldn't be quite enumerated until later on in the history of science. This is Elizabeth Carrington Morris, who, the botanist. As I mentioned, she was a specialist in ferns. This is one of the ferns on the left side. It's actually from Harvard's herbarium, a specimen that she found along the Wissahickon. It was incredibly rare. It's called the Asplenium pinnatifidum. It's a lobed spleenwort. And when she sent the specimens to Asa Gray, he got very excited about it and said, "You have to send me more," because he knew that, and she did this with lots of specimens, but basically he knew that specimens were power and he couldn't go out and harvest these things himself. He couldn't be an expert in all of these local environments, but he wanted to know all about American botany, native plants here. And so he wanted more specimens because as soon as he got them, he sent them to Kew Gardens and William Hooker, who was obsessed with ferns, writing a book called The 100 Years of Ferns, something like that. And so he sent all these specimens. So I found some of her specimens in Kew Gardens. Her specimens are all over the world because of the distribution from Asa Gray. And he needed that power of gifting things to other botanists so that they would then gift things to him, and his own stature and Harvard's botany stature would rise up in accordance with that. So she was really a helper in many ways with Asa Gray. The bottom book that you see kind of propped there is one of Asa Gray's textbook, the botanical textbook that he wrote. She edited it for him to kind of help with clarity and questioning issues and bringing up stuff. And she was always very careful about her editing, always being very deferential, but she really helped him. She edited lectures. She gave him suggestions. She illustrated things for him. She also illustrated many books that were being published about American trees. No credit on those. She didn't want credit. She wrote prolifically in terms of scientific articles, also completely anonymously. And it took a lot to discover all those articles, and I'm sure that I didn't discover them all, but I found many of her pseudonyms and was able to uncover a lot of her work that way. She wrote under many different pseudonyms. And she was really, she also chose to study a lot of plants that were often overlooked, plants that were very common, things that would be in your backyard, like dandelions, that were overlooked by many of the people, the leading botanists who were more interested in discovering exotic things, going on long expeditions across the country, overseas, to find the rare plants that have never been named, and take credit for that and name them for themselves. Whereas she was looking at the weird behaviors of dandelions rising and falling and discovering new things that Asa Gray hadn't even known. And then it ended up getting into Asa Gray's textbook and other people's textbooks along the way. Again, uncredited, you have to kind of find the threads to put it all together, but she was working in that way. And so when I first came across these women, and their names in the archives, I had never heard of them. I like probably many of you. And I was confused about that. I didn't assume that I know everybody in the 19th century. That's impossible. But I just figured that if there was this, these people who were the first or doing these, or were tied into these major scientific networks, I should probably know their names. And so part of my project, in not only working to figure out what they did and who they were and what their lives meant, was also to look at why over time they were erased and how they were erased, both in their lifetimes and then in the years and centuries afterwards. So looking at the demolition of their house, so there's a historic preservation issue here, and that's what you're seeing in the image on the right, was the tearing apart of that enormous botanical garden. And then their house as well, which was an erasure in many ways. There is the naming of species for other people, because these women couldn't be in the rooms where these decisions were being made. And so people could kind of manipulate things, even though they were the ones sending the specimens in. There were also scientific footnotes and kind of trailing. I would look for the references to discoveries and articles that, say, Margaretta wrote about peach beetles and kind of following it, and how that eventually they would not be cited at all by the time the USDA was publishing a thing. Like there would just be a kind of a a gradual erasure through footnotes, scientific footnotes. And also they didn't have obituaries or memorials that were written typically for scientists and other peers of this time period. Then there's also archival collections. So their stuff was distributed because they were from a wealthy Philadelphia family. In many ways, their papers were preserved because of their relations. But there was a large collection of scientific papers that were sold to the Library of Congress by a collector in New Hampshire. And the collector looked at these letters. It was all the letters that these sisters had received from various famous scientists. And the collector, just made a decision that the best name for this collection was the Asa Gray papers, because there was a lot of letters from Asa Gray. And the Library of Congress to this day call them the Asa Gray papers, even though the only thing that coheres with that group of letters is the fact that it's from Margaretta or it was all the letters received by Margaretta and Elizabeth Morris. So there are all these erasures that have happened over time that just mean that we've lost track of who these people were. And that is why, and what I find about that, interesting about that, is also that it's not just one like nemesis who is out to get them. There's no villain or one singular villain. It's this tiny accumulation of erasures that really led to their being forgotten or lost. And so there's implications for why we keep stumbling upon all these forgotten women who were in science, or forgotten marginalized scientists generally who have been erased from the historical record, how these things accumulate until we don't know to have a collection about them or to think of their names when we think of early American women. So I'll stop there. But so that's a quick overview of the whole.
Can you talk a little bit about the origins of this project? Because, Taming Manhattan, your first book, is obviously a very different sort of project than this. I know that in the introduction to the book, you have a very sort of compelling story about how you got caught into this story. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
This was not the book that I intended to write. I had set out to write the history of a tree. Taming Manhattan is a mucky, messy book that involves pigs in the street and mud and human waste and parks and manures and shanty towns. So this is very different. It's a different life entirely. Kind of elite Philadelphia and people in kind of intellectual communities, but. I set out to write the history of this tree, the ailanthus tree, the tree of heaven, which is a city tree that often is a city tree and has had a checkered past with as an invasive species or a welcomed plant. And I was about 2 years into that project and I was working at the New York Historical Society looking at seed catalogs. And the archivist there said, "Oh, you should check out the papers of this botanist named William Darlington. He has he's written about the ailanthus tree and you might find something interesting there." And I only had like an hour or half an hour before I had to catch a plane home. And so I'm going through the finding aid quickly. And I saw there were 250 letters from this woman, Elizabeth Morris. And I Googled her and there was very little. There was just almost nothing. Her sister, Margaretta, had a short, barely correct Wikipedia page. And so I checked that out too. And I kind of patched it together about who they were. And I just wrote this in my notes and then went home. And I was like, okay, but I'm still focusing on my tree. And then the next month I was here in Boston to give a talk at MIT. And I went to the zoology museum or library at Harvard and was looking at Thaddeus William Harris's papers, who I know is a big, I now know is a big part of this institution too. And he had a whole bunch of letters from Margaretta Morris. I was looking at, he's an entomologist and he had written about ailanthus trees and dropworms specifically and how they weren't affecting the ailanthus tree. So I was there to look for that specifically, but then coincidentally fell upon letters from Margaretta and her words stopped me in my tracks. She wrote something about how she basically that she wanted him to be her friend, that she was panting for the sympathy of someone who could appreciate her love of entomology and look past the fact that she was a woman who didn't have access to libraries. And I think, Andy, that night we had dinner and I was like, I think I'm putting this tree book aside because these women are really compelling and they seem to be following me and into different archives. And so I did. I put that book aside and started just obsessively digging into these women and finding every little bit I could find about them.
So what's happening with the tree?
I'm in discussions with a biologist who works on, he's a moss specialist, but he's also very interested in invasive species and kind of poking at villain plants in general. And so we might co-write an article at least, or maybe a book. I don't know. Well, to be determined at this point. I'll probably go back to it.
So you call this, I don't know if you call it in the text or you said it to me, a braided biography. And each of the chapters sort of doesn't hold true for the whole book, but you sort of move between the sisters and each chapter sort of talks about some kind of discussion they're a part of or discovery that they make or scientific debate that they enter into, sometimes on their own accord and sometimes through others. Can you tell, because in those chapters, you also do a really great job of sort of setting, putting this in the wider context of, in many cases, what is agricultural history or agricultural problems that are related to the history of science. You have the cicadas, you have the Hessian flies. Can you talk us through sort of what the significance of one of those is and what the discovery was that was so compelling?
Yeah, the Hessian fly one was a little bit confusing to me at first, but during the Panic of 1837, there not only was all this economic and real estate stuff going on, but it was also, there were wheat issues. And so the Hessian flies were really infesting wheat fields and devastating the wheat, enough so that the price of wheat was going up precipitously, not unlike our own groceries, I guess, really. But so wheat that costs, say, $7 a barrel in 1836 was now $14 a barrel, and that was devastating to a lot of families. And there were flour riots in New York in 1837. So this is a huge deal. And so Margaretta went into the fields to see the Hessian fly. One of her tutors from when she was a teenager had discovered the Hessian, or had named it, not discovered it exactly, but named the Hessian fly. And there were all these debates about whether it had actually come from, what had been Germany, and so, or what would be Germany. And so she wanted to just see it. What she ended up doing was discovering another fly that was almost indistinguishable from that fly. And when she tried to get other entomologists to take her seriously, they dismissed her. So Thaddeus William Harris was like, you don't know what you're talking about. You're reviving an old debate. His counterpart, so he was the librarian at Harvard. The librarian at Yale was also an entomologist on the side, and Edward Claudius Hare, and he also denied, was just like, let's shoot this down, let's publish an article that will kind of deny her any kind of right. So they were really trying to tamp it down, and a lot of the reasons why they were doing that was they were pretty insecure in their own professional situation. Agricultural entomologists were not taken seriously among even entomologists. They were kind of like the lower of the entomologists, but even in the naturalist world, generally entomologists were seen as weird bug catchers. And so they were kind of low, like astronomers being at the top, like the entomologists were looked down upon anyway. And so he was insecure. So was Herrick at Yale. And they didn't have professorships. They were struggling professionally to be taken seriously at their own institutions. And they just didn't want this woman part of the conversation at all. She ends up being fired up about this. She was very hesitant to go public with this all. She had published something with the American Philosophical Society ultimately on it. And that's when she started getting shot down about it. But she, instead of just being silent, she gets angry and decides to keep going. And so that ends up projecting her into a very public science career. Whereas her sister took probably the message like, oh, I am not stepping into this. And she remained anonymous instead of putting herself out there in the same way.
I wanted to ask you about one of the key themes that comes out in this book is this issue of professionalization. So you do this extraordinary work of sort of talking about what is science in the 19th century, and who's collecting and who's sort of synthesizing. And there's these vast networks that are just so interesting, that are composed of what you call sort of like amateurs, and then sort of like more formal, folks who have university, college jobs. So can you tell us a little bit about that world? You did a little bit, and can you also talk about some of the argument you make around this process of professionalization we see in the 19th century, and how it affects women, like the Morris sisters in particular, maybe also women more generally?
Yeah, because there were a lot of women that what I uncovered here was that especially through all the letters and the correspondences, that there were just a lot of women who we don't know about, who've written, a botanist who's living in Ohio, who is also giving lectures about women's suffrage and anatomy out there, and no one has written about her. Like, she's just a complete unknown. There are all these people, huge, all tied into these botanical networks. But networking is a big part of this. Really, this time period before the Civil War, it's not professional. It's not professional in like a very formal way. It's professionalizing. There's like some hardening of professions, but people can't make a life as a scientist. They're basically, if most parents, if their children were becoming scientists, like these men who became tutors, that was like, oh, what are you doing with your life? Like, no, you should be a lawyer, maybe go into religion, like something else, become a doctor. Like, and many of these men went to medical school and then got into natural history, as it's called, or natural philosophy, through medical school, and kind of followed that path. But they couldn't make money until the kind of 1840s, 50s, 60s. There's like little bits of jobs, but not really even great jobs. Asa Gray was sort of an outlier. He came from a farming family and then did this. But because of this, because you couldn't make money on it, it was open to marginalized scientists, or people who otherwise would have been marginalized, to kind of get in there. So Margaretta and Elizabeth, even though they were too old to have gone through some of the schooling that women, like even 15 years younger than them, could go to all the seminaries and things like that, they were too old for that. They would have been the age of the professors more than the students. They were still able to get in on this. They could, even with their sort of unstructured education, that they kind of, their self-directed education, they were able to get in on this. And the amateur title wasn't a negative thing. It had the meaning. We now see amateurs as people who are flubbing things up, but they like doing what they're doing. Back then, it was someone who's doing it for the love of it. They're not doing it for money. They're not going into geology so they can become miners. Or to make money off of mining contracts. They were doing it for the love of it. And so it was pure. Money was not corrupting anything. And so that was actually seen as an asset. And so when men were doing it because they came from wealth and they could go do this, that was an asset. And then these women are also kind of doing, were they taken as equal? No. But there were people who were able to kind of get in on these conversations early and help. But what happens is, like Elizabeth was saying, she sent all these specimens that built up the career of Asa Gray. And then he really got to be a professional, like symbol for botany, and things then hardened off, and people like Elizabeth and Margaretta couldn't be part of those conversations as much anymore. People start elbowing their way in. The Vassar professors, the Vassar students who are studying, they're kind of pushing their way out. All these different seminaries and women's colleges are trying to edge their way in, but there's more hardening off in the later 19th century. So it's a weird moment of kind of a mucky professionalizing moment.
In a sort of similar way, I mean, one of the real joys about this book is the very sort of embodied experience that you capture in the place experience of the Wissahick Creek, Germantown, and suburbs of Philadelphia, and the sort of, I don't know, my question is, in terms of thinking about blurring of lines that we tend to use to think about professional and amateur, recreation, sort of, more disciplined observation. You've really blurred that. You've sort of created this narrative of these women who are enjoying themselves in nature, and also doing serious observational scientific work. So I'm wondering if you could talk about that, and if that was to what extent you wanted to develop.
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, it's just the reflection of the time period, and blurring just exists right at that moment. But also the life of a career. I mean, if you're following your passion, right, you're going to be delving deep into some topic out of the joy of it, right? Whether you're a writer or a historian or a scientist or whatever. And that's what Margaretta would go off to solve a puzzle when there's potatoes that were like having beetle infestations, and it's timing with the Irish potato famine. She wants to figure out if those beetles are causing the famine. And so she just goes deep into it, just follows down that rabbit hole and works on that for years, obsessively. And Elizabeth too will be like, there's something going on with my raspberries. Let's figure out the raspberry diseases. And they're getting really into, through that joy and just like the choice of just having the time, and they have the luxury of time and the ability to do that to some extent. They have restrictions on their time too. They have to care for their elderly mother and for family members and things of that nature. But there is a blurring of that kind of professional and life. I mean, it's work-life balance ultimately. And also just they're working on plant diseases at the birth of that as a field at that moment, and figuring that out, and how diseases are transferring between plants, and they end up becoming really big in that. But these relationships between people, it's still things that exist within our professions, but we kind of think as a profession still as very hardened off. And so I think that's a limitation of our understandings too. But yeah.
I think similarly, you present these women in very fully human ways. They're flawed too, and they have, and you don't shy away from that in the story as well. So can you talk about, and there's people interested in biography here too. How did you grapple with that as, wanting to sort of create their history and their memory and do them justice,
right?
But also, what areas did you sort of struggle with in their lives?
Yeah, there are so many Venn diagrams of power, right? And so these are women who are white and wealthy and well connected to the scientific world because their cousin is a professor at University of Pennsylvania and all this sort of stuff. They have connections. And so they're unlike some of their other peers of other women who are working in the sciences at this time. And I wanted to make clear, put them in their context too. And so Margaretta writes out her gardener in a description of how she was discovering the cicadas by using the passive voice. And so it talks about how the cicadas were dug up, and so I leaned into that to be like, well, there's also this working class man who's working in her garden who remains unnamed. I don't know exactly. I know her gardener from 5 years prior. I'm not sure if it's the same gardener. And so she's writing someone out, and that's the tendency of the profession at that time. It's not like male scientists were giving credit to everybody below them. They weren't, and she was just kind of following suit with that. But I wanted to make sure to call that out, just to be like, well, here's where she's also holding some power in this situation. Or in their politics were not very clear. They weren't outspoken activists in the ways that we kind of look for some women pioneers or for women trailblazers, I guess, to be activists. We want them to be the suffragists also. They weren't. They were very single-mindedly focused on their science, and they didn't write much about suffrage. So yeah, there's certain things.
Civil War stuff.
For Civil War stuff, yeah, where they Margaretta was staying with a relative in Virginia, so they were very much a border family. They had relatives in Virginia as well as in Pennsylvania, and kind of went back and forth. And she was staying with a relative when John Brown raided Harper's Ferry, and she was like, "That guy is crazy. The slaves here don't really care. They're not going to go." And I was like, Margaretta, wrong side of history. But there's I tried to call. I think it's important to show these people in all of their colors, because if we turn them into just pure heroes, then they're not real. And I think it's better to show whatever minor flaws. So they're minor throughout, but they're humans, and so they have their perceptions in the moment, or they have their moments where they're holding on to power as best they can too. Yeah.
I have one more question, then we can open it up. But I want to get back to that question you raised in your slides, which is about erasure, which is a theme that runs through the story. The erasure in the scientific world they're engaging with, in, the world of citations and credit. There's all kinds of other erasures that are happening here in terms of their archives, right? That their papers get put into the ASA grade papers, that they don't have their own dedicated archives. There's the erasure of their home and their garden to make room for the school, which you talk about at the end of the book. And so with all this erasure, there's this like really valiant work of, trying to bring their story back to life. And so can you talk about that challenge? And you talked about the fact they're using pseudonyms. Like there's so many layers of difficulty here. Can you talk about your research process a little bit and how you did that work of sort of finding the buried treasure?
Yeah, I think in many ways, I don't think this project would have been possible 30 years ago when many of the kind of women historians who work with women in science, they wouldn't have been able to uncover it, partially because the family hadn't donated materials to archives yet, but also because of digitization, because I was able to find needles in haystacks in ways that wouldn't have been possible in 1980 or 2000 even. So finding things that had been digitized allowed me to look up their names and find that there are 20 different archives where they had 3 letters in University of Michigan's archives and 2 letters at Penn State and whatever, all these like kind of random things. And then the archivist could take photos of these things and send them to me. So I didn't have to go to every single one, but only the big ones that had large collections. And that made it possible. The pseudonyms, oh my goodness, the pseudonyms, that was a hard one. So I fell upon, there was a digitization, though Margaretta had no obituary, Elizabeth, who had been such a prolific science writer for the Gardener's Monthly magazine in Pennsylvania, she wrote lots of articles. And when she died, the editor who just loved her, wrote a short obituary and outed her with not like maybe 5 of her pseudonyms, which were mostly initials, which are very hard to search for in the archives, or in the, on archive.org or whatever. So it's just like E or ES, like that's not going to come up with much. So I had to read. I am quite the expert on agricultural journals and gardeners' journals, horticultural journals from this time period. Read them cover to cover. But she wrote those. And then when I got to go to the University of Delaware's archives, where her brother-in-law's papers are, she kept a journal, or like a diary basically, where she kept drafts of a lot of her articles that she wrote under pseudonyms. And so I was able to find like 8 more pseudonyms and fill that out. And so I'm sure there are more that I missed, but that was my way of figuring. And then as I was reading her letters, I kept falling across articles in these things written by an old lady who was writing about entomology, but very modern entomological science of that moment. And I was like, that has to be Margaretta. And then I ended up coming across some of her drafts, like that weren't signed. There was like partial drafts of things about apple moths. And then I was like, oh, that's the apple moth thing by the old lady. And I could patch that together. My favorite archival story is the most random one and the most magical one, I'll say, like that happened at the very end of this project when I was not expecting to find anything new. It's on my kids' playground, just talking to parents. It was during the pandemic and the heat. And I live in Portland, Oregon. I'm nowhere near all of the archives for this project. I'm not on the East Coast. I'm on the playground and making small talk with a dad, and he's talking to me about his insurance business, and I'm telling him about my book, and he's asking me who the scientists are, as many people would, because they would be like, well, maybe I know that scientist or whatever. And so I told him the names, and then 2 months later, he's back on the playground because the babysitter has COVID. So he's back there, and he's like, by the way, I might be related to those scientists that you're writing about. And I was like, no, really? And he's like, well, I know Morris is a common last name, so who knows? But I might be. And so I sent him all the genealogical work that I could, like that evening, and said, maybe this is, and he's like, yeah, I'm descended from their brother. That's my middle name, all this sort of stuff. He traced it out. And he's like, and my uncle lives an hour away and has one of their books in his attic. And so I had seen all of Elizabeth's like poetry. She kept these friendship albums, and they were like full of poetry and paintings that her friends and her sisters and everyone had contributed. But I had nothing like that for Margaretta, who kept a lot of her cards close to her chest. I believe as I said, I think she was in a relationship with Dorothea Dix. I think she burned a lot of letters. I think that there was a lot missing. That uncle had the great uncle of my kid's friend. This is mind blowing. Had the Margaretta's friendship album in his attic. Brought it out in the middle of the pandemic. I was like newly boosted from a Delta surge, whatever. And these people opened their house to me and let me go through and take photos. A lot of the paintings that were in that book are on the cover now. Or within the book too. And I happened to be writing one of the last chapters. I'm sorry, I'm going on so long. It was just still like this magical. I was writing the chapter where both sisters die. Elizabeth dies in 1865 and Margaretta dies in 1867. And I had very little. Margaretta basically stops writing after her older sister dies. She didn't publish anything. All I had was her will. That was the only thing that she really produced that I had. And I was kind of stuck with that. I'm like, how do I deal with a sisterly relationship when this kind of goes silent? And this book had her poetry about grief. It had a painting she had done of a maple leaf in honor of the year anniversary of her sister's death. It had so much that was written into it that it was like, it was almost, I'm a little woo-woo now, like being like, they're haunting me, they're making my life easier, whatever. Like, but it was the most magical history experience I have ever had. Whatever lesson I've taken for that is I'm going to be talking on playgrounds all the time about whatever I'm working on in hopes that something comes out of an attic. Who knows? But it was kind of phenomenal. And I expected things to be in people's attics because nobody had written about these people. No one really knew them to be important at all. So I expected things to come out after the book was published. I had no idea that it would happen in such a micro place in Portland, in my neighborhood, in my kid's school, and my kid's friend in the second grade. You know, like it was just like a little bit mind blowing. Yeah.
I've never thought to look at a playground, but there you have it. This is great. So we can open it up to questions in the room. I don't know if we have questions online, but please wait for the microphone and please keep your questions, comments to please moderate yourself. Thank you.
Thank you. Simple question. How did these women get interested in botany? It seems like most of the ladies at the time would have been doing dolls or things of that type.
Yeah, botany was much more feminine in the 19th century than entomology. Entomology was a rare one. Or if someone was interested in entomology, it would be butterflies. And actually they had plenty, I probably showed some images of butterflies. There's butterflies on the cover of the book. They painted butterflies a lot. Margaretta rarely painted the pests that she was studying, or at least that stuff doesn't exist anymore. There are certain things that were destroyed. They talk about their scientific notebook, whatever. In any case, she probably did some kind of drawing of that. But it was common enough for botany to be a safe science for women. Actually, sciences were taught more in girls' schools than they were taught in boys' schools. Boys who had to prepare for the college entrance exams and get really, good at Latin and math and all that sort of stuff. They were focused on that. There wasn't the space for science classes. So most girls' schools from the early 19th century, they advertise in newspapers about how ample their science offerings are. It's actually quite shocking in terms of when we now talk about getting girls into STEM or getting, adding equality, that it was almost the reverse back then. And almost to the point where in the 1880s, people were publishing things about like, it's okay for men to be in botany. It's okay for you to be interested in flowers. It can be manly. It can be manly to be into biology. And they were trying to justify it in that way still, because there was such a profusion of women involved that it was kind of and even sometimes the scientific nomenclature would change in ways that people are like, well, now the women will get out. If we make this complicated enough, they won't be involved. And there were those kinds of machinations in university departments when they're talking about changing nomenclature, traditions too, but they don't get out, they stay. But yeah, it continues. But it is really interesting, the gender dynamic between these fields, isn't it? Yeah.
If there are questions online, let's go there first.
Yep. I have a question from Thera Webb. She says, hi, I'm from the Women in STEM archivist and at MIT, sorry. And I focus on the history of women in STEM and making archival collections more discoverable for historical research. She asks, I know it can be extraordinarily difficult to find photos of people, especially women, with their names attached to them from that era. How did you find those photos?
Yes, and I really wanted to see them early on, like right after I had that dinner with Andy, and I was like, I'm changing course and I'm going to be working on these women. I wanted to know what they looked like or kind of envision them, and it was impossible until I got into the archives. And Google searches are not reliable that way, as the question implies. Like it's like you could even right now, if I were to Google Margaretta Morris, photos of other women will come up that aren't her at all. And it's just the kind of mashing, it's the way you can't trust AI, right? Like there's just a mashing of imagery. And so a name appears and then it kind of doubles that way. So it is hard. And I think going to the source, right? Going back to the archival, it's the only way to know. Even then in their collection, not all the photos were, like there's a large collection, the Little family papers in Delaware have a large number of unnamed photos, and I was eventually able to make sense of who these people were. And some of those images that I showed, they have these brooches also that show their kind of obsession with natural history on the brooches too. Like there are ways to get into the clues to get into it, but it is hard. And yeah, Google searches are terrible that way sometimes, especially with these obscure or people who have been obscured figures.
Can you tell us a little bit about the decisions of how to structure the book? Because Andy referred to, and I've seen other braided biographies where, it's complicated, it's not obvious. So I'd love to know a little bit about what process you went through.
It is hard because you overlap their lives in some ways, and some of my chapters have both of them. For instance, when their mother gets sick and their worlds constrict and they're in their house instead of able to go off and on their botanical or entomological adventures to find things, they're just like in their house for a whole chapter, and then it's both of them together. But really, Margaretta's story was quite different from Elizabeth's, and because of their different approaches. And so I'll have a chapter on Margaretta and the Hessian fly and how she's putting herself out there and then getting slammed down and then kind of coming up with lessons. And then a chapter about Elizabeth and all her pseudonym, I'm going to mess up that word, her anonymous writing, and how she's finding her voice in those agricultural journals and then horticultural journals. And then also how she's networking with people and how the lessons she's learning about networking. And then a chapter about the cicadas and Margaretta's discoveries about cicadas, but Elizabeth's coming in there to like help with the networking because that was the thing she was good with. And so she helped to strategize and bring all these men to their garden to bear witness to the cicada discoveries that Margaretta was making. And how so she's finessing things, and they're almost working like these sisters are almost working like the married scientific couples of the 19th century. Like there's that similar kind of like, well, I'll help you do this and I'll do the dinner party that we're having with Louis Agassiz and kind of chat him up about marine biology, and you get the gardener out to get the cicadas up, and we'll have this whole day of it. And then Louis Agassiz becomes a major supporter of them with his checkered past and all, it's this complexity. I try to, so it's braided, but then it gets tangled at times, and then the braid kind of comes back together. Yeah.
Back online.
Yep. We have a question from Dan Howlett. He asks, can you talk about the religious lives of the sisters and how it influenced their scientific lives?
Yes. So they rarely wrote about religion unless somebody was dying. That was when they would bring up God at all. Their father was from a large Quaker family, Their mother was Episcopalian, but there's Quakers back there too. So it's very Philadelphia story, but that really kind of influenced their social standing in the city, but also the fact that they had access to all the education that they had, because the Quakers really took women's education very seriously. Their great aunt, who was an Episcopalian, Elizabeth Powell, was also very pro women's education. So there was a lot of like push for education that way. Their mother remained very religious. She helped to found the local Episcopalian church when their father dies when they're toddlers, and they move out to Germantown, and she founds the church. But they donate stained glass at some point, but they're not very religious generally. And from my sense of it, like Darwin comes into their lives and then towards the end, and they seem to have had no problem adjusting to ideas around evolution. At this time, there was no disjuncture there. They kind of were embracing kind of the pre-Darwin evolution ideas that were coming around. So religion played a role in as much as it could, but just more culturally than dogmatically, I guess.
Thank you for the great presentation. I got curious about those more pseudonyms, and I think that Louisa May Alcott had some very fanciful pseudonyms, and they're the Bronte sisters with their pseudonyms. But what do you make of were they all just initials, or were there some kind of funny ones? Or
there was one that was like an amateur farmer or something like that, and they had stuff where most of them were initials. And Elizabeth would write ES, which is like the very first letter of her name and the very last letter of her name, I guess. I don't know how else to place it. And she'd always say that she was from a fictional place called Utawa, Eutawah. And there is an Etowah in the South. And I was trying to it's connection. Is there some kind of tie into that? It's not. I tried everything. I don't know. It was for someone who had to do a lot of searching through digitized things. The Utawa thing was like a lodestar. Like it was like my one way to get at a lot of the ES, or sometimes she'd just sign E, or sometimes she'd sign it M. Like, I don't know. There were just like random, but there were times she mainly wrote for the ladies' pages in agricultural journals. And so she was outing her gender in some ways that way. But she also wrote in the general section, and she would call herself Americanus. So like something that you would never guess that this was a woman, or an amateur farmer. And she would be like basically helping her sister kind of slam down an argument about trees, because she would pose a question, and then Margaretta would write the response the next month under her own name. But Margaretta also made herself androgynous with her byline. So she would be M.H. Morris instead of Margaretta. She would make sure she wasn't being listed as Miss Morris as much as she could. In the end of her life, she didn't care anymore. She was just allowing Miss Morris to be thrown around, or Miss Margaretta. But for a chunk of when she was trying to build up her voice, she was just being the androgynous M.H. Morris, or something like that. And if she wrote something that she found uncouth, like she was talking about how you could solve a peach disease on a tree by putting human urine on it. It happened to be while she was also caring for her mother while her mother was sick, and she wrote that under a pseudonym. Like she wouldn't put that under her own. So she had this kind of dance of pseudonyms and non-pseudonyms too. But yeah, gosh, what a mess! How complicated to figure it out, right?
Back online.
Sure. We have a question from Professor Jessica Linker. She says, "Hi, Catherine. Thank you so much for this talk. I'm wondering if you can speak to the ways the sisters may have participated in scientific debates that were occurring among women in the mid-19th century. One of the fascinating things about the Darlington papers are the women correspondents who seem to have strong opinions about Elmira Phelps, etc. Do the Morris sisters collaborate with the other women, or have strong feelings about other women who are scientific practitioners?"
Yes. I mean, mainly they were connected. William Darlington is this major kind of a mensch of this era. He said some things that are a little bit not great, but he mostly is really connecting women and excited about having all these women in his own network. And he collects all of their papers are all bound in these books that Professor Linker has clearly seen. They're bound together in these volumes, which it's just amazing. So there's so many scientists to be written about just from that alone. Elizabeth becomes friends with some scientists, some women scientists through Darlington, and gets connected to Isabella Batchelder, who's also a Massachusetts name, and who is another kind of anonymous writing scientist. And also she marries Thomas James, who's a professor out here. I think he's a professor out here. And it helps his career and kind of helps to with Asa Gray also. So she's connected with these people and having these conversations in this network. And they are also kind of networking to get women more connected to other people too. But they're not really. I can't think of any. Well, yes, Elizabeth does not like Elmira Phelps at all, and doesn't like the way that she works in her textbook. So there are some kind of like debates where they're not necessarily lifting Elmira Phelps up, but not necessarily debating her directly, more in letters, kind of snide remarks in the letters about her approach to botany and the kind of nomenclature issues in the books too. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much. So my question is about the artwork that you discovered that they did, whether it was related to their work or not. I've studied architects before, especially from the 19th century, who have, depicted the world in certain ways, whether it's related to the buildings they're designing or not, and that kind of gives an insight into how they saw everything and how they understood what they were working with. So I was wondering if you encountered anything like that with them, and how much the visualization of what they were doing kind of like played into the work that they were doing.
I wish I had an image that I could pull up right here. There's this beautiful painting of an iris that Margaretta does in her book, the one that I found in the attic in Oregon. And it's interesting because it doesn't follow the same genre of all these women scientists or just botanical artwork of this era, because it shows the plant has been eaten by aphids. It has all these holes and mars all up and down the leaves. And you see this like triumphant damselfly perched on the plant that it has eaten the aphids, right? And so it's something that I feel like that was very specific to how Margaretta was seeing the world. She didn't care about the plant being perfect. She wanted that damselfly, and it's and so that was one way that I saw it. Other times the images are kind of, they're beautiful and they're actually spectacular in their beauty and the painting and the artwork. And they were trained by some major artists of the natural history artists of this time, like Charles Alexander Lesueur is a major one from France who comes to Philadelphia. But they're beautiful unto themselves, but they follow the same genre of like, here's a beautiful flower, here are the flowers, and here's a butterfly that's perching on the flower. So it kind of follows a similar genre generally. But I love that iris one specifically just because of the damselfly and all the Mars on the plant itself too. And they venture into algae also and other like sea things that are going on too. So they kind of branch out from just the typical flowers and butterflies too. Yeah, thank you. That's a great question.
Back online.
Yep, we have a question from Maureen. Maureen, you should be able to use your microphone. We also have a question from an anonymous attendee. In the meantime, they ask, can you talk about your choice of title?
Yes. The book was actually supposed to be called Sister Scientists. That was the title that I had pitched to the press, and that was what was going forward. And then about I don't know, 2 years before the book was set to be published, a social media account called Sister Scientist came out, and and it was about like hair products and things like that. And so I was just like, I'm stepping back. I need a new title because it was going to be too conflicting. And so the Mischievous Creatures had actually been a chapter title for the Hessian fly chapter, and then I ended up pulling that up to play around with that instead. So that's social media is the answer. Yeah. So yeah, and I think that's been a little controversial. Sometimes I've been nabbed in reviews about that, about whether they truly were transforming the science or were they not. And they were transforming the science, but in this way that's been decentered. I think they were like, Elizabeth was behind the scenes and helping to really lift Asa Gray up in ways that transformed botany, but did not get any credit for that. And Margaretta Morris was pushing these conversations and edging people towards like the plant disease science in ways that are, again, uncredited and erased. And so that's the transformation. Yeah. Thanks.
I knew about the tradition of women in botany, but other than your person who did entomology, the only other woman I know anything about is Maria Sibylla Merian in the late 17th century. So do you know anything about between the two dates? Was there any kind of a tradition of women in entomology also?
There were others also working in entomology. Dorothea Dix, actually. Nobody writes about the fact that she was quite the scientist, and that she was kind of like one woman expedition force who would go out when she was going to review all these mental health asylums. She would go and collect things and then send it back. I actually, like, a possible side project, but if anybody wants to write a biography of Dorothea Dix, like a better biography than exists, I highly recommend it. It's overdue because she gets kind of she gets a hard pass on a lot of these. But anyway, she needs a better biography. But she's a scientist, really. She publishes on entomology in the Silliman's Journal, which is based out of Yale, and she also sends specimens back to natural historians simultaneously whenever she's out on the field. Even I just pulled up recently from the Schlesinger Library, they scanned her diary when she comes out to Oregon. I was looking for, and it's all botany and all entomology. It's just like lists of specimens that she's collecting there. Which is incredible. So there are people who are working behind the scenes. They're not as prominent because it's not necessarily seen as the respectable science for a woman. So they tend to be these people who don't care, who are willing to just do what they want to do and not care about what other people think in that way. And so they tend to be more trailblazing, I suppose, in some sense.
Back online.
We have a question from Stacy Roberts. She says, as you've been talking about these sisters, I can't help but think of Daniel Mason's Northwoods and the botanical sisters in that novel. Their apple farm, their legacy on the plot of land. Can you speak more to the relationship, perhaps the codependency of these two sisters, and how it may have helped or hindered their relations with others or the broader community and or the scientific world?
Yes. Oh, I love that book. And I love that there was a connection to these sisters from that book. That makes me really happy. And may they be haunting someplace. Maybe they're haunting me, who knows, just like in that book. But the sisterhood, that was both one of the challenges of writing this book and the braiding that we were talking about, because they were always together. They never wrote to each other. And so if I could create any source for them, it would be like letters between them or the diaries where they sometimes write about each other in letters to other people. And that helped me. And when Elizabeth wrote anonymously and when Margaretta wrote anonymously, they poked fun at each other. And so there'd be Margaretta's anonymous articles would talk about Libby or about Betsy, the old-fashioned housekeeper who can't get things right about how to make soap correctly or something like that. She would like talk about things and kind of domestic science. and make fun of her sister. When Elizabeth starts getting into silkworms and decides she's going to have silkworms in their attic, and then the silkworms get all over the place and she finds them really gross, and her sister gets a lot of mirth out of this. And so she talks about that. And so you can see the humor going between them, which I appreciate. And their codependency, like when one gets sick, the other one's like trying to find ways to get them all out together on a hike and figure out how to kind of help each other do each other's sciences. Yeah, and how did it affect things? They actually, there's a story that's in the book about they were targeted by an arson twice in the period of 2 weeks, who burned down 1 week, burned down their barn, and then exactly 2 weeks, almost to the hour later, burned down their stable, which are adjacent buildings. And they were after it was very hard for me to pin down who this was. They thought someone was bribing someone else and all this. There was like big drama around this, and happened to be during a time of a lot of arson in Germantown. They thought someone was targeting them specifically to silence them and to attack two old maids. And you could see that sisterhood and that kind of the quirkiness of them, and the fact that they're kind of living this like alternative lifestyle. They often compared themselves to the ladies of Llangollen, in these two women in Wales who lived together in kind of almost probably a kind of a Boston marriage, I guess. They kind of spoke about it in that way. So you see that sisterhood and that kind of connection, and then I guess the targeting from outside too. But gosh, I love that it was connected to Northwoods in someone else's mind, and because I read that book recently and adored it. Gosh, yeah.
Time for a few more questions. Anyone in the room?
You spoke a little bit about their eminent tutors in natural philosophy, but the illustrations you show are so exquisite. Do you know what their training in art was like?
Yes. Yeah. So, I mean, many scientists of this era were also great artists because they needed to be. There's no photography, right? And so if you're going to discover a new beetle, you have to be able to illustrate it. And it's like in ways that we don't appreciate now, because in our schooling, the arts and the sciences are quite different. I mean, there's now STEAM, right? Like where you're adding the arts, you're trying to jam it back in, but it was very, very much connected, even poetry too. And the way that people wrote kind of the wonder of these things it was a way to to observe very in a slow way. If you're like you're painting something, you have to watch and be able to be very botanically specific, and then describe it also. So yeah, they were trained probably by multiple, even some of the kind of just what we would consider the straight up scientists were also artists, like Thomas Say and Thomas Nuttall, but also this guy, Charles Alexander Lesueur, who had come from France and was working in Philadelphia and couldn't make ends meet. And the way he did was he taught painting to people all over Philadelphia, but women mostly in Philadelphia, including these two sisters, and spent a lot of time in their neighborhood and in their community, and really appreciated their art too, and wrote about that a little bit. So there's those kind of connections, and they were very lucky to have these tutors who just really needed to make money. And it made it possible for them to have what was the equivalent of one of the best scientific educations of this time period.
We have a question from one of our committee members, Carl Nickelmo. Carl says, wonderful presentation and discussion. I'm struck by what you said about Margaretta's discussion of moles and cicadas. Can you speak about more about her ecological descriptions? Were they mainly focused on inter-animal interactions?
Yes, and it ties into trees too. So her cicada discussion, the cicada discoveries were all because her pear and apple trees in her backyard were failing. And so she had, and Elizabeth was concerned about the trees. They were discussing what to do with their orchard. They were going to cut down the trees and replant. It was springtime, which is when you put your new fruit trees in, whatever. And they decided to dig around the base of the tree and find the cicadas are sucking at the roots of the trees. This is still controversial to this day about whether or not cicadas actually harm fruit trees, but that was what they were finding. And still some extension centers of agricultural schools will say as much. But Margaretta found that there were some trees in the back of their garden that had revived on their own without their intervention. And it was because moles had been there, and the moles were digging below and eating the cicadas, and the trees revived and were producing fruit and had great leaves. And so she's like, she wrote articles being like, save the mole. You might be after your mole because they're digging holes everywhere. They seem to be ruining everything, but they're actually saving your trees. So save the mole. And so it's an interconnection and basically pro-mole propaganda to like make sure your orchard would stay together. Yeah.
We have time for one more question. Anyone in the room?
Could I ask either to read from the end of the book or ask you to read from the end of the book as a concluding remark?
Yeah, you can.
It feels strange reading your words.
Okay.
Here with you. This is from the end of the book, and I think it's just the sort of the book. The whole book, as we've discussed tonight, is really sort of a brilliant book about looking closely at people who also looked closely. And I love this ending. So
thank you, Eddie. Just as they had as girls, as older women, they held tight to the wonder that would come with a hike through the forest and a slow afternoon in search of beetles or orchids. There was always something more to find, something new to astonish them, something they had not noticed before that they could paint or write about, something they could share with each other and the world. Margaretta and Elizabeth were working within the limits of their moment in history. They had finite time and other demands on it, but they never lost the thrill of paying close attention to the world around them, bright, verdant, and alive. Yeah.
Right. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming to our first seminar of the season. And pick up a copy of the book if you're interested and have your own magical historical experience. Thank you very much, Catherine McNeur.